Welcome to My Bookcase Slays, a podcast where we discuss killer books with their writers. And today I'm very excited to introduce everyone to Eva Jurczyk. She is the writer of 620 to Montreal. Eva, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Eva, this is a really challenging concept for a mystery because you are doing what I think is the hardest thing of all, which is creating a locked room mystery. Talk about what inspired that decision.
I think that there's some things from when I was really young and some things that have been happening really recently. I love a locked room mystery. So I think anyone who writes or reads mystery was raised on, the Agatha Christie's, the Murder on the Orient Express and all those. And there's something so wonderful about that. Like, you have your fixed cast of characters, you have your location, and you have to figure out what's going on inside there, and it needs to be exciting enough to fill that space. So that's always been in the back of my head. I love reading those. I like also anything that's happening in sort of a condensed timeline too, where you need to have a lot of that. And it did feel to me like we'd had a really recent resurgence in the locked room mystery genre, in film in particular. I'm a huge fan of the Knives Out movies. There's one coming out really shortly, and I think that first one had just come out when I started writing, and it had me thinking about that. There's a great horror film called Bodies, 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 which was, again, just all locked in a house. So I'd been thinking about that as a concept a lot. I like, as a writer, to have sort of structural challenges, like ways to make things a little bit harder on yourself. And a locked room does that because there's only so many suspects. There's only so much action that you can provide when you have those structural elements. But then there was another really practical piece of inspiration. I had heard about another writer who really often, I think he did it once a month, took the train from Toronto to Montreal and back again as a sort of self-styled writing retreat. Because if you've ever taken that train, the Wi-Fi is terrible, which is great as a writer because you can't doom scroll or do any of the things that you're doing instead of your writing. So it can be a really productive time. So I thought about doing it for a while, and I finally booked a ticket for myself. And I said, okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to have this writing time. It's going to be so great. I was doing it right around Christmas. 2 days before I was meant to travel, there was an awful train disaster. No one was hurt, but there was a terrible snowstorm, and the train was stranded on the tracks between Toronto and Montreal, sort of, I want to say in the middle of nowhere. It turns out they weren't all that far from a town. It's still not clear to me why they were stuck there for that long, but they were out there for about 12 hours. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. Apparently the toileting situation was the type of disaster that I did not go into my book, because I'm like, I don't want to touch that. And the passengers really sort of went crazy and broke out of the space. Eventually they busted out of the train and just like walked through the snowstorm to find help for themselves. So it was a really testament to the fact that it's not, these locked room mysteries aren't making it up. Enclosed spaces make you crazy. Enclosed spaces make people's emotions run really high. So I had all these inspirations from fiction that I had loved from when I was a kid, and that were popping up in pop culture. But I had this really sort of present example too. I did get on that train 2 days later. I did make it to Toronto and Montreal and back again in the day with nothing terrible happened. But yeah, there was a lot that was percolating in my brain that landed us trapped on that train car.
It is a very scary thing to think about, being trapped like that. The train is not quite as terrifying as like a boat in the middle of the ocean, or like an island where you're really limited to help, but a snowstorm is definitely confining.
Yeah, definitely. You say a boat in the middle of the ocean. I would never take a cruise, for example. It is just, there's absolutely no way. Maybe one of those river cruises where...
Right. You could swim to shore if you had to.
You could swim to shore if you really had to. But the idea of, being trapped in the middle of the ocean at the mercy of the elements, a snowstorm is scary. If we're being honest with ourselves, like a snowstorm between Toronto and Montreal, it's like you'd be fine. It would take takes a little bit of time, like it does for my characters. But, thinking about if you were in a mountainous space or something like that, trapped by the elements in that way, I think that there is something about that intersection of this like man-made enclosed space and the actions of the elements upon it, which is interesting. And I think everyone's a little bit afraid of that. I think you always sort of have that in the back of your mind. If you're booking a flight or a train or a bus ride and you're doing it in the winter, if you're somewhere in a cold climate, I think everyone has that in the back of their head. Like, what if this doesn't go great?
Yeah. And you immediately look around who is with you and you start appraising them, right? Let's talk about your characters a little bit because it's a limited space and it's also a limited cast.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is a really fun part. When I took that train from Toronto to Montreal, I did have a guy who was seated in front of me on the train who was one of these, like you could tell he was a little bit wealthier, really loud talker, had a lot of opinions about everything, was a little bit rude to the staff. He became, he became a character in my book who's who's renamed, who's I will say, he's like you have in the Agatha Christie books. Usually, the character who dies is someone who's not very nice in the beginning. So he became my character. I knew that I wanted a staff character. So Dorcas in the book, my beloved Dorcas is. I think that those characters are always really interesting. Someone who's like a little bit in the background, but actually exerts so much control over everyone else who's there in a given setting. They often get the least time in stories in a real life. If you're on it, like how much time do you spend thinking about the inner life of the person who's serving on a train or an airplane? But really, I mean, you should. They hold a lot of power over you. So I was thinking about that. I have a mother and son grouping, which I thought was really important. I really wanted to have that parent and child. And the child in air quotes, he's 19, I think. So really on the cusp there of manhood, but in the mother's eyes, very much still her baby. I wanted that. I have kind of like the manly man, not in a bad way. I mean, not in a troublesome gender dynamics way, but the man who kind of looks like he knows his way around a workshop and can probably help get you out of these situations, and thinking about our expectations about who that is. And then I have what I would say is my two main characters, Cyan Candel, who's an online yoga influencer. And I think that that's a type that most of us are pretty familiar with. For good or for ill, these people exist on a spectrum. I like YouTube yoga also. There's a place for that. I love some of my Peloton fitness instructors. But then there's the person who's at the other end of that spectrum. And then Agatha, who's this not award-winning, a best-selling novelist, who's there to write and whose job really is observation. So she steps on this train to have some intense writing time, but is also looking around at the people who are on the train with her and thinking about who are these people. I'm the type of person who I'm very deeply nosy. So I'm always observing the people around me. I very often, take out my phone and jot down little things in my notes app if I think someone has a really great name, or if I hear like a piece of phrasing that I think is really interesting. If really often on public transport, and the train is no different, people will say things to each other not realizing that it's a public space, like as if they're in private. At the beginning, one of the characters is having a really loud phone conversation about what sounds like to everyone else on the train about a divorce, about pretty private things. And I think we do that in these spaces all the time. When really often when I ride the subway, I have my headphones in but nothing playing, and I just like listen to people's gossip, listen to what people say about the people that live in a big city, but it's not like that big a city. I've definitely overheard things about people that I have 6 degrees of separation from. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the cast of characters, I tried to populate it with different, you almost want archetypes in some of these stories, but I wanted to maybe challenge some of the reader expectations about who these people are.
Was there a character that was particularly challenging for you to develop, or did they all come to pretty fully formed?
That's an interesting question. I think that the character of Vivian, so who's the mother of the almost adult son, was probably the most difficult for me. Because I was writing, the character, the primary character that I was writing was a woman who was dealing with potentially not being able to mother her son for the long term. This is a story of grief in some ways. So imagining Vivian was imagining a different version of that. It's sort of like a life that my main character couldn't have. So that was kind of emotional. In some ways, she's a pretty small side character, but she's a character who will do anything for this son, whose son's safety is the most important thing in the world to her, who has a level of desperation about whether or not her son would be okay. So I think accessing those feelings and thinking about, well, what would that look like in the story if you had to place this woman who is really sort of like a diminutive, quiet woman who just, takes her son to college, doesn't want to embarrass him. Like, it's a pretty normal mom in a lot of ways, and thinking about, well, what would it look like if you put that woman under pressure, and how far would she be willing to go? I think that was what was most challenging for me.
I'm a mom of 3 older boys, so my baby is 21.
Oh, okay.
But they still, I thought you captured really nicely how they do need you still. There's a dependency there, even though they are considered adult men and everything, and they want to be adult men. There are moments when they're like, Mom, Mama, Mama, and still in their 20s.
Yeah. And I imagine in real life that feels really good. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be in a moment of stress where there's like a medical emergency.
No,
You don't
no,
want to be called upon in that way. But I think for having adult children, probably,
yeah.
well, still quite young.
And every maternal instinct just kicks right in. Like, you hold their hand, you do all the things to help them.
Yeah. So that was a sort of interesting headspace to get into.
It is interesting. After I read your book, I was reflecting on how many ways you created parallels in a very small cast with Agatha as your main character. And every single person on that train has a parallel existence to her. Did you do that intentionally, or was that a happy accident that developed down as you were writing?
50-50 in a
Yeah.
way. I think the mother-child relationship is the most important parallel, and the thing that I was thinking about the most. So Agatha spent a lot of the story thinking about her own son
Yeah.
and her relationship to him. And then obviously you have the Vivian and Rupinder relationship, which is what that relationship would look like if it were given 15 more years, if she were allowed to live to parent an adult son. So that was the one where I was really thinking about those in parallel quite clearly. The idea, so there is another writer on the train.
Yeah.
The idea of establishing that identity for that character really came at the end.
I loved it. That was a slight spoiler. I'm not going to say who it is, because that would wreck the ending for people. But I thought that was like, oh no way!
Yeah, and that was really. I had somebody else read the book, and they said that they felt like I owed more to that character.
That's a nice way to deliver it.
Yeah, so then I went back and thought, okay, who is this character? Like, let's think a little bit more about their identity, some of the why behind their actions, and then that parallel was written. And so those are the ones that I thought really deeply about. But the rest is probably a little bit accidental, but I think that that's reflective of the fact that we're not that different from other people than we like to think we are. If you have someone who you want to be a best-selling novelist over here, you want to be a yoga influencer over here, some of what you want is pretty similar. The ways that you're thinking about getting there, the talents that you're drawing upon are different, but in some ways you want the same thing. You want attention for doing this thing that you perceive yourself to be really great at. Yeah, probably some of it is accidental, but it's more a reflection of like, yeah, we're pretty similar to the people around us in more ways than I think we care to admit.
Yeah, probably. I would ask you which character would be awful to hang around with, but I think we know the answer to that question. What I would like to ask you instead is, who do you think would be the most fun out of all the people on the train? Who would be the most fun to hang out with?
Dorcas.
Dorcas?
Without a doubt. So Dorcas is the character who's the train steward. I love a deeply competent woman. Like a woman who just know that she knows what's up in life, who just can navigate any situation. And I think, Dorcas as written is, religious, biased, but she has a little bit of a streak to her. She has underneath those thick uniform tights that she's wearing, she has a tattoo. I feel like Dorcas maybe gets around. I
Okay.
think that if you were at the door of a trendy nightclub with Dorcas, I think that the bouncers would look at her and they would see something in her eyes and they would let her in. I think there's a streak in that woman that I think would be fun for a night on the town. But also, Rupinder would be fun to hang out with too, because I like basketball. So we could go to Raptors game together.
Is there a question that friends and family keep asking when they get to the end of the book and they're talking to it after finishing it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because in some ways, the book parallels some of what's happening in my life. A character of Agatha is um, suffering from cancer and was sort of in this depressive period, I really think pulled underwater by her grief at the fact that she was going to leave behind a child and her husband and all that. So the book is in some ways like a difficult one for my friends and family because still, it's an ongoing, pretty real situation for us. But I think in some ways they are surprised. I think I'm a lot more like day-to-day functional than the character of Agatha. I'm able to get out of bed and I have not succumbed to my urge to just drink bourbon and watch reality television much as I would like to. But I think that we've talked a lot about how grief can kind of make you crazy and different ways that grief acts upon the people who are in a given situation, the people around it. When your life is changed in a way that you didn't expect, how that doesn't just impact the person that it's happening to, that it impacts family units and social groups and friends, that really ripples out. And there are different ways that people deal with that. So, some of my friends and family have come to me and be like, you okay? Like, do you need, should we be looking at psychological help? I'm like, no, 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 this is on the page. I'm fine. I'm getting out of bed. But that has been, I think, what we've talked the most about. What does grief look like and what does that do to you? And when you're ill, physically ill, how well equipped are we to think about what that does to you psychologically when the expectations for the life that you thought you were going to have change in that way. So that's what we've talked a lot about. And that's what I hope that people talk about. I think illness is a tricky one. There's a scene in the book where the character is reflecting on being in an oncologist's office and she's being the young cancer patient. And, she has her identity as the young cancer patient.
Yes.
And somebody else walks into the office and he's younger than she is.
Mm-hmm.
And he's carrying this book called Dying Well, and she's sort of ticked off because she thinks that both he's younger but he's not grieving as well as she is. So I think that there's some room for a discussion about like what does it mean to navigate something like this, and how can you help a person in your life who is navigating something like this, or for you as the partner or caretaker of someone, how well are you caring for your own needs as this terrible thing is happening to you? So it's a little bummer to talk about grief. I promise it's a really fun book to
No,
read, but I think
it's real because in a good complex story, every character is going to carry their baggage, right?
Yeah.
You've written a person with so much baggage. The illness is one aspect of her. There's like a lot of other complex stuff happening too.
Yeah,
I don't giving too much away, but yes.
Yeah, but I think that's a reality for a person, going back to being in close space and developing a cast of characters. That's what you don't see, whether you're on a train with strangers or you're in your workplace with people who you see every day, but probably only know on a surface level. A very small amount of that baggage. I mean, some people are oversharers and sometimes we develop deeper relationships. But for the most part, if maybe if a coworker of yours, for example, is getting divorced, but you probably don't know that for the 4 years leading up to that, they've been miserable at home and their life has been like falling apart. You don't know that. You just know that they're being a jerk to you in a team meeting, and you don't really have any of that necessary context. I think when you write something like a mystery novel or a thriller and you have to make people act a little bit crazy, like you have to make people act in a way that is beyond like normal or expectable human behavior. If you're doing that, then you have to let the reader in on what's going on in the background. So you do have to bring some of that baggage to the forefront.
Yeah, otherwise it feels contrived, right?
Yeah.
So, what is on your bookshelf these days?
I just finished reading The Wedding People, and it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be. For some reason, I thought that it was more of like a domestic thriller, like one of those beachy thrillers. I don't know why I thought that. I'm like, oh yeah, thriller set at a wedding. It's not that at all. And I blew through it. I really like put aside some of my responsibilities to read that. And what I loved about that book was that it is in some ways very sad. It deals with some very, very heavy subject matter, which I don't want to spoil it for folks, but it is like set at a hotel on a wedding. So if you love that as a setting, and we do, right? A week with people at a wedding at a super fancy coastal hotel, sign me up. But it deals with some pretty heavy content, but it's so funny in exactly the way that I love books to be funny. It's almost funny the way that British people are funny, that us as North Americans, I don't think we have the same access to that sort of
Right.
like dry humor.
Overstated, especially Americans.
Yeah, but it's so deeply funny in the way that I really need sad things to be.
Nice.
I think that if you are writing about heavy subject matter, then you have to sort of acknowledge the funny. So I love that along those same lines, because it's been sort of, a tough year in our household dealing with health stuff and all that. I've reread the entire oeuvre of David Nichols, who's best known for writing One Day, which is, the book became a movie, then became a Netflix series, follows those two characters in love over one day. And so he's written a lot of books. I don't want to say those books are all the same, because they're not. They center different like professional spaces, and the characters are different, but they all are sort of about like somebody's falling in love and coming of age, and usually you spend some time in a college town and all that. And that is just like a lovely place to spend time, because there's tragedy, you're in these great British settings, and they're deeply, deeply funny. So I think most people have read One Day. I think that's a really popular book, but I would really encourage people to go all the way back and to go to your library or whatever, and find the full set of his books, because they're really just a delight and help you feel better. I'm trying to think of what else I'm reading. Oh, I tackled as my summer reading project, because I try to do one a year. I read Middlemarch, which I'd never read before. Also, complex relationship dynamics. It was a little bit spicier than I expected it to be, in terms of how honest people were about marriage and money and all those things. I loved all that in the work of Austen, and this I thought was even more sort of upfront with some of that. So, I mean, recommending in Middlemarch to people is silly. Most people have read Middlemarch, but I hadn't, and I loved it.
That's duly noted. That's awesome. So we've got the 640 to Montreal, killer read, locked room setup, very challenging, and a really dynamic cast of characters doing some crazy things when they get trapped together. And of course, there's death, multiple deaths, pretty grisly towards the end. But anyway, I won't give anything away. But Eva, thank you so much for your time today and the book recommendations and the insights on your book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure chatting.
And thank you to the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network for helping produce this show.